Hello, everyone, and welcome back to artifact number 8. In today's exploration, we're going to have a good time looking at the development of the human form within Greek sculpture. And in order to sort of understand some of the differences that we'll see over the course of time, I think it's important that we point out some of the different periods that art historians have broken the Greek culture into, because the kinds of things we see around 900 are going to be very different than the things we see in the middle of the High Classical. And so much so, I would suggest that the things we see at 600 are going to look very different than the things we see in 480. So traditionally, we have we have named the periods sort of after some stylistic tendencies that are rather frequent. So geometric involves the ways in which the body is geometric, and orientalizing involves the ways in which Greek art begins to see an influence from the this part of Asia Minor. The archaic is a word that designates its difference from classical stuff. And so we've always put them into these categories. The geometric dates from 900 to 700. The orientalizing lasts only 100 years. The archaic is 120 years from 600 to 480. And then things get quick. Early classical from 480 to 450. High classical from 450 to 400. Late classical from 400 till 323. And I never can remember, and I should by now, whether or not 323 is the birth or death of Alexander the Great, but it's one of those. And then the Hellenistic period goes from more or less that time until the beginning of the Roman explosion in the first third of the century before Christ. So we've looked at a map of Athens before, or of Greece before, the Greek world. And so I just want to call your attention to Athens here. A lot of what we're going to be looking at will be from this pace, but there are other places that will be common, right? So Melos here, that's where the Venus de Milo, the Venus from Melos, was found. Um, so sometimes we have names of objects on the basis of where they were found. We're going to look today both at statues of the human body, but also of different kinds of objects. And here's one of them. It's called the Diapolon vase. And Diapolon was the name of a cemetery on the outskirts of Athens. And this is a kind of crater. Crater is the shape of the vessel. They have kind of like a really long neck, handles on a big oval egg-shaped side. And this is a big object. It's probably about 3.5 feet tall. And if we look at the ways in which the human body has been rendered in this, clearly it is geometric in nature, right? We have a triangular upper body, these breadstick-like legs. And if we think about this object and what it is we're seeing, it can help us get to the function. For here we have people, their arms are raised, and they are quite literally tearing the hair from their heads. And this person lying down is dead. So this was a kind of burial structure, not so much for the remains of the person, although the Greeks did um, um, cremate the dead. These were not for ashes. It's way bigger than you would ever need for the ashes of a single person. Instead, this was kind of like a tombstone that that it would be placed in a cemetery. Everybody would know who this memorializes. And again, it's a vase, but it has an open bottom, which means you would pour liquids through it as a way of memorializing the dead. And so they're really, really interesting and important objects. And you can see around it, we have these geometric patterns that we call meanders. And the word meander, doesn't it, means just kind of to wander around, like my assistant, she often, when people come by to see me and I'm not here, she'll say, he's off roaming. And what that means is I've gone to another building to go talk to people, but sometimes I walk without a definite purpose. Like I'm just going to go find an adventure on campus. And so I roam, I meander. And so this geometric patterns are called meanders. The bodies have been broken down into very strict geometric shapes, which will be very different than the kinds of things we will see in just a little while. I mean, in order to really appreciate some of those things, maybe we could turn our attention to something that is a little more, oh, I don't know, let's just say three-dimensional, and let's start with this. This is a great example of an orientalizing statue. It's not very big, it's a couple feet tall. But clearly the body has changed in some ways. It's not as geometric. It looks like there's actually a body there. But this is a little bit different from the the archaic, the geometric period that we're looking at beforehand. In order to really appreciate some of the other things that are going on, we need to shift gears a little bit and talk about the archaic period. And in order to do so, I want to show you a couple of really interesting objects. And here's one of them. This is a statue, and the statue itself is now in Munich, of all places. You can see kind of like the textbook image on the left-hand side in a picture I took a couple years ago. This is a statue from a pediment of a building. And if you were to imagine our pediment, and again, a pediment is the triangular top of a Greek temple front, this guy would have fit nicely in the corner of a pediment, right? So if you imagine this being our pediment here, that outline there, he could have fit in this corner right there. And let's talk about this guy. The temple is from the Temple of Apphia, and this dates from around 500 BCE. So this is the very end of the archaic period. And I ask you a kind of simple but complicated question. First of all, how is his Monday? And you might say, it's kind of bad. He has an arrow going through his sternum. And I agree, he does. And now I ask you to look at his face and I ask you, how is his Monday? Because he's a perfectly pleasant smile going through it. And full disclosure, I have never been shot through the sternum with an arrow. But I have, gotten a paper cut before. And the face I make when I get a paper cut is far more gruesome than the face this guy's making, and he's got an arrow going through his heart. And so this is a really interesting representation of the human body. And let's contrast it. Oh, here's I forgot about this picture. These are the statues from that temple, how they fit, which is really cool. Let me show you another dying warrior taken from the exact same temple, but done just maybe a decade or so later. Think about this guy. Now, he does not have an arrow going through his sternum, I grant you. But hasn't he been shown as if he's in real struggle and maybe real pain? That if I were to ask you, which of these two guys do you want to be, you would probably choose to be the guy with the arrow, but the smile, rather than whatever the guy on the right is going through. This shows the ways in which sculpture is going to change in a hurry. That really, very quickly, we're going to see changes to all of these bodies. And as a way to think about that, I'm going to give you this guy right here. He is the calf bearer. He dates from about 560, and he is an archaic statue. And this object shows some of the major characteristics of Greek archaic statues. And if you know these three things, you'll be able to recognize an archaic versus a classical statue with very little difficulty. The first is what's called the archaic smile, but I sort of think of it as being kind of a smirk. This kind of weird little smile that seems kind of misplaced. It's just the way people are shown. He's got it there. So this archaic smile consistently shows up in Greek statues from around 600 to 480. The other thing we will often see are cornrows, braided hair. And that braided hair is both kind of a style thing, but it also provides extra support for the head. Now, to be honest, this guy doesn't need more support around his head. He has a cow around it. But many Greek statues, like that guy, don't have a cow. And so providing them with a different level of support helps their heads not get knocked off. Because heads get knocked off. I mean, my neck size on my dress shirt is a 16 and a half inches. That's not a lot, right? That's not my waist. My waist is 34. And so providing hair makes that neck stronger, so heads are less likely to be destroyed. And then the final thing we will see is an unconvincing sense of motion. And what I mean to suggest to you is that it looks as if the Greeks are trying to make the bodies appear as if they're in motion, but they're just not quite there yet. When they get there, they're gonna get there. And we saw this with the Egyptians, and I'll bring back an Egyptian statue for in a second. The Egyptians also had a difficulty or a lack of interest in really rendering motion. Menkari and his wife, he's standing, he's got 1 foot ahead of the other, but you never got the idea that something crazy like taking a step forward was actually going to happen. The Greeks are not here yet with the archaic period, but in time, they will get there. One of the ways in which we talk about these objects is we call them a Kouros figure, Kouros, but it means a very specific kind of statue. Kouros in Greek quite literally means male youth. And so it only shows a certain kind of statue. This is not a Kouros figure because he has a beard. And unless you're like some kind of hormonal freak job, you probably don't have a beard when you're a youth. I didn't have a beard like in terms of like I could grow a beard until way after 18. And so it's not a word that means statue of a man, it's a statue of a youth. And those youth are often shown with relatively athletic bodies. And as a way to get there, I give you this guy here. He's called the New York Kouros, and he dates from 480, and he has all of the elements we would expect to see in a Greek archaic statue. He has the archaic smile, as you can see. He has an unconvincing sense of motion, although 1 foot, the left foot, is ahead of the other one. There's certainly no expectation that something crazy, like the right leg swinging around him, is going to happen. And he also has the cornrows. And if we were to think about the rendering of his body, there seems to be some problems to it, right? Like it's almost geometric in some ways. Like his hips are this V, his pectoralis muscles are merely like a looping kind of W. The rib cage seems to mimic the crest of his hip bones. When you look at this body, you automatically realize that there's something not quite right about it. And it's called the New York Kouros because it's in New York at the Metropolitan Museum, and you walk around and he has the weirdest, pardon me for saying so, the weirdest butt I've ever seen in a statue. And I've looked at a lot of statues' butts. This one is weird. It's just flat as a board. I mean, there's like, it's as if they didn't know that there was a muscle back there called the gluteus maximus, and the reason why the gluteus maximus is called the maximus is because it's big than most muscles. But this is perfectly flat. There is a sense of flatness about this object, and hooray for getting another student in. So that's Beth Cool, one of the first students I taught at Clark University. These things vary in size from a few feet to 15 feet. And the functions are usually as burial markers, although that will change through time. Now, this is an Egyptian statue, although it dates from around this time frame, right? So when I think of Egypt, like the heyday of Egypt, I start with Narmer, with the pre-dynastic around 3000, and I go through the end of the Amarna period. So let's call it 1200 BCE. But Egypt still exists. Egypt is still making art, and this is kind of a very, very late classical Egyptian work. But you can see the relationship visually between what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in Greece at about the same time. And way back when, artifact whatever ago, we talked about Khafre and bilateral symmetry, and I did my little fancy trick here where I flipped around the upper body, and you can see that there's a sense of bilateral symmetry. And that was one of the things that the Egyptians were keenly interested in. So I can do the same thing here, and all things considered, you'll see that aside from looking a little bit like an alien, he kind of looks the same. And you might say, Brian, no, he doesn't. And I'd say, yes, he does. And you might say, Brian, no, he doesn't. And I'd say, you just give me time. One of the things that the Greeks are going to become fascinated with is the idea of what's called contrapposto. Contrapposto is the fancy Greek word for weight shift. And when normal people stand, they don't stand with both feet together and their weight perfectly distributed between their two legs. That's just not how people stand. Most people stand. It's how my dad stands, but it's not how I stand. And so this is, gosh, an old picture now. I had so much hair back then. This is maybe from 2007 when my dad and I met up at my uncle's house in Wisconsin. And I told my dad I wanted a picture, and he said, why? And I said, I'll tell you later. And so this is a picture of me and my dad. Please note me standing like a normal person. I've got one leg kind of bent, the other one straight. And please notice how my dad, Colonel Zygmunt, is standing with both feet together and evenly planted. We'll come back to this in a little while because it's going to be important for us. So when we think about this Avinas Kouros is from a little bit later in the archaic period. We still have our smirk, we still have our cornrows, and we still have a kind of sense of unrealistic motion, and he has an inscription on him on the base of it. So we know that this was used as a burial marker, but the anatomy is certainly gotten better, hasn't it? I mean, if you compare the anatomy of this guy and that guy, clearly I'd rather wake up with that, rib cage tomorrow morning. But something that is also shifting is the ways in which bilateral symmetry is changing. Like, he's getting the calf muscle now, but even still, right, left and right kind of look the same. But that's going to change. And it changes in 480, and this is the transition from the really early, and that's not the Kritos boy. Let me get rid of that. This really changes from this Greek archaic period here to the early classical there, right? So this is archaic because there isn't really a sense of weight shift. But when we get to the early classical time frame, one of the things we see is the development of that contrapposto. Contrapposto means weight shift. And what this means, and you don't have 2 feet on this guy, I grant you, but what it means is that we have a sense of weight shift, and we can tell because of the ways in which the legs look and the ways in which the hips look. This is the weight-bearing leg. It's straight. This is the non-weight-bearing leg. It is slightly bent. And that does some interesting things biomechanically. One of them, it means this side of the hip is taller than that side of the hip. And that might be a really small thing. But that really small thing affects the ways the rest of the body works together. So for example, if you were to think about that, think about how the shoulders are no longer perfectly balanced or symmetrical. This gives the whole object a sense of sway to it. And think about this as it pertains to, well, symmetry. I mean, you ready? That's not bilaterally symmetrical anymore. It's just not. And aside from the fact that he looks like Michael Myers from the Halloween movie, that bilateral symmetry is gone. And what has replaced it is a sense of motion. I mean, these things were done about the same time frame. But what's interesting about them is the ways in which in 50 years we've gone from a kind of pattern representation of the human body to one that's much more relaxed and refined with a greater sense of motion as well. And if this is the beginning, by the time we get to 450, there's going to be some really big changes that are going to occur. I mean, it's a much better butt. Right? It just is. It is a much better rendered human body. And this is the beginning. And by the time we get to 450, Polykleitos, the name of the sculptor, is going to take us in a brand new direction. Now, this, my friends, is a Roman marble copy of a bronze Greek original. The bronze Greek that Polykleitos himself made has long since been melted down and made into bullets or a cannon or something else. But the Roman marble copy still survives. Now, in its own day, this was not called Doryphorus. It was not called the spear bearer. It was called the cannon. The canon. And I don't know if this is going to work. Let's see if I can pull up my dictionary. I'm hoping you can see this. One of the definitions for the word canon is, of course, like something you shoot guns or bullets out of. But the other is a canon is a list or sacred books accepted as genuine. Let's see. This is going to have to work. A collection or list of sacred books, or a general law or rule of which everything is judged. Perfect. If you are an English lit student, let's say you go to college and you're an English major, if you haven't read anything by Shakespeare, you failed. Your university has failed you. If you have not read, I don't know, what, like Hemingway, The Gatsby, if you ever had To Kill a Mockingbird, those are the accepted greats within a field of study. This class, in many ways, is about the canon. Like, during the course of all of this, I'm going to show you the most famous stuff of the famous stuff, right? You're going to see the Colosseum, you'll see the Pantheon, you'll see the Parthenon, you'll see Notre Dame. This wasn't called the spear bearer, it was called the canon. It was the accepted measurement. And what Polykleitos was trying to do was to show us the most perfect human body. And in doing so, he does go out of his way to demonstrate that contrapposto. My friends, I give you the weight-bearing leg here, the non-weight-bearing leg there. I don't mean to suggest that I'm the Doryphorus, but that's the weight-bearing leg there, and this is the non-weight-bearing leg there. This is contrapposto. This is weight shift. And think about the sense of motion that he has. I don't mean to suggest to you that he can dance, but I will make him. But he does have a sense of motion about him. And now think about bilateral symmetry. That's a beginning. That's a taste. And how about that one? I've been laughing at this for like 12 years now. This is not bilateral symmetry, right? This is the breakdown of that. I particularly like the third, the biggest sternum ever. This is a sense of disbalance, which I really, really appreciate. So let's talk a little bit about how we do contrapposto. When you stand casually, like I do, not like my dad. My dad is at attention all the time, but I'm at parade rest because I'm not Colonel Zygmunt. When you stand naturally, you have one weight-bearing leg and a non-weight-bearing leg. This causes your hips to shift. One leg is relaxed. That's the one here on the left. And one weight is weight-bearing. we call that the engaged leg. So if this is the relaxed leg, that's the engaged leg. Now, if I do it on the other side, now I have this one as the engaged leg and this one as the relaxed leg. Now let's do that with the Doryphorus. This is a certain kind of contrapposto because his legs are doing stuff and his arms are doing stuff. And for those of you who like want to be doctors someday, one of the things you'll learn is that our muscles work in tandem. If you flex your bicep, you've extended your tricep. So one contracts, the other relaxes. Without that contraction and relaxation, your muscles don't work. So on this side, this arm has been flexed, right? He's brought the fist up. Originally, he was holding a spear. He is holding the spear in that arm. That's the engaged arm. It's doing something active. And the engaged arm is on the opposite side of the body as the engaged leg. This is the relaxed or free side of his body. They likewise are on opposite sides. And if you want to think about it in a certain kind of way, we could draw lines through those, and that gets us to the letter X, and we call that the chiastic pose. CHI is the Greek word for letter. We call that the chiastic pose. And so I'm going to make this guy dance. This is going to be the highlight of my day. I'm ready. I hope you're ready too. So here we go. Make him dance. You don't think I can do it? I feel like I can. Get down and work it, buddy. This is our dancing Doryphorus. This is what happens when we get to a sense of motion. This is merely rotating him around his central axis, and he is working. And I kind of wish I could do music in the background. So that is a sense of motion. Here's our New York Kouros. All right. I'm going to make this guy dance, and this guy dances like I would dance, which is to suggest not really well. Like, that's not so impressive, right? Whoop-de-doo, Brian, go, man, go. That's different than this guy, and I like it so much I have to go back and do some more of it. This is one of the major developments of the Greek sculptural world, that we begin to see the ways in which motion is introduced into sculpture. That happens beginning in the early classical period and finds its full kind of explosion with the high classical beginning in 450. Now, I mentioned to you that we don't have that many bronze statues from the Greek world because they get melted down, but sometimes we get lucky and sometimes they sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And so in the early 1980s, a shipwreck was found off of the coast of Riace here. And in that shipwreck, they found two mid-5th century bronze statues that they swum down, put balloons around, inflated them with air, and brought them to the surface. And here they are. They're now called the Riace bronzes. They date from around 460. There's two of them. We lovingly call them Warrior A and Warrior B. And bronze allowed, because these were cast in bronze, that they're free from the need for support that almost all marble statues are. So let me go back and show you this. The reason why this tree trunk exists here is because the stone isn't strong enough to keep him upright. We need, you think of stone as being really strong, but stone is really weak in a lot of ways. So you see this little clip there, that attaches the wrist to the leg, because without it, this whole thing would be risky. If you were to remove that right there, just break it off and give me a hammer and a slight temper tantrum, I could have that arm off of there in 5 seconds flat. Because stone is really weak. There's a reason why we have so many statues without arms or heads. If you think about, oh, I don't know, the Venus de Milo, she's a great example of this. But once we get to metal statue, that's not needed. So our arms can do crazy kinds of things. And this is a good example of how that can look with bronze statues, Ryachi Warrior A and B. These are cast from bronze, and they have, wait for it, silver teeth and copper nipples, lips, and eyes. And they would have been inset with like colored stones in the eyes to begin with. That was just so awesome. Like the silver teeth are great. These are hollow cast, which is different than carving, right? If we were to think about the difference between these two statues, for the stone one on the right-hand side, it began by me having, let me do this real quick, me having a hunk of bronze or hunk of marble that was this big. And over time, with a lot of patience, I chisel and sand and carve all of the unneeded stone away to reveal this stone here. But this is cast, not carved. And the process with that is certainly different and worth our talking about. So in order to explain this, I'm going to cast a bronze head, just a bronze head. It's going to be Bob's head. And to begin with, I am going to carve Bob's head from something soft and meltable. In reality, it's a kind of beeswax, but for today's purposes, we're going to call it butter. So I've got a gigantic, like 50-pound block of butter, and I'm going to carve Bob's head into it. Carve, 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 carve. Ah, I have Bob's head in butter. And now what I'm going to do is pack that head of butter in a very refined, high quality form of clay called silt, right? So in the middle of that block of clay, I have Bob's head in butter. And now I just melt Bob's head out. And if I wanted to make a solid Bob's head in bronze, I now have a mold. And I could quite easily pour molten bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, into that mold, and voila, I've got Bob's head in solid bronze. But solid bronze is two things. One, really expensive, and two, really heavy. And why would I want to have a solid bronze head if I could have a hollow bronze head? Because a hollow bronze head would be less weighty and less expensive. So I take more meltable material, beeswax, but I like butter. So today we're going to do butter, and I'm going to cover the inside, all of that, with butter, right? So that I've created a mold, and the inside of the mold is all covered with butter. And now I pack the rest of that casting hole with more of that same clay. I then melt out the butter. And what I have is an armature to pour liquid bronze in to and leave just a hollow cast shell. It's a pretty laborious and time-consuming process, but it allows for bronze casting statues. And the Greeks don't invent it. It's been around for thousands of years, but they certainly use it to good effect. I give you my favorite picture of an ancient Greek sculptor and then a statue on the left-hand side as well. This is a famous object, and this exists in dozens of copies in museums all around the world. It's called the distablos, or the discus thrower. And it shows you how quickly the Greeks are going to move away from bilateral symmetry. This is a three-dimensional object that is meant to be walked around. It's meant to be seen. And the view of it changes. In a lot of ways, I think of this as being almost made of two created arches, this sort of sloping arch from hand to hand, and then this enormous trunk which kind of goes from his armpit down to his knee. It's like he's been created by two different archways. And one of the things that's fascinating about this object is it changes as you walk around it. You would never really want to put this object in the corner of a room. you would want to put it somewhere where you were able to appreciate it from all the different angles, because the left angle and the right angle and the front and the back all look different. In many ways, it only adds to the sense of motion of this object, because as you move around it, it seems to be moving itself. And that shows one of the real great developments of the high classical period. And think about how different that is from this right here. And I know that you think 150 years is a whole lot of time, but it's not. It's a blink. It's a blink of time. And these are, practically neighbors in time. It's a moment. And think about how differently these two objects look. It's just amazing. And it continues on as we get to the late classical period, because one of the things that happens is that, one, the proportions of the human body are going to change, and two, the Greek gods become a little more human. They begin to be shown doing kind of human, everyday kinds of things. And this is Aphrodite of Knidos. Knidos is the fancy, or Aphrodite is the fancy Greek word for the goddess of love and beauty. The Romans call her Venus. And Knidos is the island where she was found. And there was a famous art historian in the 18th century who talked about the solemn grandeur of late classical work. And and what I think Winckelmann was trying to express is that they have a greater sense of seriousness than maybe the earlier depictions. And indeed, during the high classical period, um, the Greek sculptors made gods out of mortals, right? Here you go, gods out of mortals. And what the late classical sculptors do is they make humans out of their gods. And I think that's a really interesting one. As the late classical period goes on, two things begin to happen also. So I mentioned to you the proportions change. Doesn't she seem like she has a smaller head than maybe than otherwise? She has a kind of a smaller head. And secondly, what is happening is the dramatic weight shift becomes almost pronounced. She stops having a simple sense of contrapposto and instead has this huge kind of S curve. It's what our art historians call the S curve. It seems as if she is um, swaying about her. And that's something that was certainly unseen in the archaic period, and only developing in the high classical period. Here's a good example of that. This is a sculptor by Praxiteles. Praxiteles, and Praxiteles develops his own set of proportions, which is distinct.
It's not creative enough for it.
Which is distinct from the sorry about my phone ringing. It's distinct from the proportions of Doryphorus. And so here we have a smaller head, a more elegant, elongated body, and you can see Hermes, who is the Greek god of messengers, right? He's got the fast shoes, he delivers things. And over here is Dionysus, and Dionysus is the Greek god of wine and keg parties. And in this arm, you can't make it out, but in this arm, he would have been holding up a bunch of grapes, almost teasing the little god. This shows a remarkable sense of weight shift that makes this look almost static, doesn't it? And so from the early classical to even the high classical, we begin to see some really dramatic and interesting senses of weight shift. I mean, this is the Wary Heracles by Lysipios, and certainly he has that dramatic weight shift. Like this is a Hercules I don't want any part of. And so all of this has been a relatively brief, but I hope fulfilling exploration of the kinds of sculpture that we see within the geometric, the archaic, and then the classical periods in Greece. And if I were to wrap things up, one of the things I would show you is just some things from the Hellenistic time frame. Because if the bodies during the archaic periods were kind of perfect, one of the things we begin to see in the Hellenistic time frame is a severe sense of discomfort or pain. I give you two works that have the same sort of shape. This was from a museum in Munich, and this is from the Capellini Museum in Rome. And they're separated by 300 years, I grant you. But I ask you, which of these two guys would you want to be? Because the dying Gaul seems to be a much greater sense of pain. I often sort of describe Hellenistic art as, do you want to be that person? And if the answer is no, then I suggest that it could be Hellenistic. This is our seated boxer. He's an athlete just like many of the other athletes we've looked at before. But he's clearly been beaten up, right? He has cauliflower ear. He has a busted lip. He has broken teeth. His body sort of sags under the weight of fatigue. Here's our old market woman. She's also Hellenistic. And when I teach this with students, I often say, would you want to be this person? Because I bet this man today is in pain. And so maybe a decade ago, I asked, would you want to be this person? And I said, I suggest that the answer is no. And a young woman said, like, I'm uncomfortable with you making fun of old people. I think there's dignity in being elderly. And I said, no, no, no. I'm not saying that this person was without dignity. This is a woman who is going about her life. She's shopping for chickens. I mean, she's got a chicken basket over here. I don't mean to suggest she's a bad person. I don't want to say she doesn't have dignity. I hope when I'm old art history professor, I still have dignity. I don't want to be old art history professor yet, right? Like my dad will be 69 this year. My dad's body hurts. Like the 18-year-old version of my body was better than this one is too. But when we get to the Hellenistic time frame, we have this interest in depicting other kinds of people, people who are maybe suffering pain or defeat. That's a great example of that. This is a story taken from the foundation of the Greek world and the sacking of Troy. Sort of a famous line, like Laocoon, that's how you say this here. Laocoon was a Trojan priest, and he went to warn the Trojan, or is a Greek priest. He went to warn the Trojans, and the famous line is, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." And what happens? The next day, the Greeks show up with a gigantic wooden horse. The Trojans think that the Greeks have fled Troy and left them this big wooden horse. And of course, the Trojans come out. They're like, "Oh wow, that's a great wooden horse. The Romans have fled. Or the Greeks have fled. How wonderful for us! Let's take that big wooden horse inside the city walls and let's all get drunk and party." So the Trojans do, and then out pop all of the Greeks inside the wooden horse, and they kill all the Trojans. And the Greek gods were not happy with a Greek priest betraying them and telling the Trojans. So what do the Greek gods do? They sent snakes to eat him, both Laocoon and his sons. Now, I don't mean to tell you that I don't want Laocoon's upper body, but I definitely don't want to get eaten by snakes. That does not look like fun to me. So in the Hellenistic time frame, we begin to see pain and suffering in a way in which we had never seen before. Our bodies during the classical period were perfect, pain-free. And in the Hellenistic time frame, we begin to see a different kind of agony, a different kind of pain, and a different kind of suffering. When next we meet, my friends, we will shift our gears and change our attention. We are off to the Italian peninsula to begin an exploration of the great things that are happening in the Roman world.